wreckage of the Dona Paz ferry sinking, the world's largest peacetime maritime disaster. It was not only a tragic accident, but also exposed the terrifying hidden aspects behind the development of the maritime transport industry. So what happened on that fateful ferry? Let's explore the story of the survivors and the costly lesson humanity had to pay in this incident through real events. And as usual, before getting into the main content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel to support our team. Thank you very much. Our story begins with Valeriana Dummer, 14 years old. Valerie worked as a maid for a family in Tacloban, Philippines. Her father didn't like this job, but the family really needed additional income. Valerie also had small joys in her work. For example, when the host family traveled to Manila, they would take her along. On December 20, 1987, just 5 days before Christmas, Valerie was at the pier with her host family to board the Dona Paz ferry. Valerie liked going to Manila, but she didn't like this trip at all. It was always crowded, noisy, and now, with only a few days left until Christmas, it was even more crowded than usual. S host family, despite having booked tickets in advance, didn't. So they didn't have a ticket for her. When they reached the ticket gate, they learned that all seats had been sold out. However, the ticket seller flexibly accepted a small amount of money and allowed Valerie to board the ferry, a quite common practice, especially during the holiday season. Among the hundreds of people sitting and lying scattered in the aisles, Valerie realized there was no empty space to sit except on the top deck at the stern of the ferry. Valerie's host family seemed worried, but perhaps they were already accustomed to this scene. They told Valerie that ferries were usually very crowded during Christmas, so there weren't enough life jackets for everyone on board. Therefore, they had bought one separately for her. Valerie felt a fleeting fear in her heart. Perhaps the intuition of a 14-year-old girl warned her of something bad. She didn't like this idea at all. Perhaps few people expected that the Dona Paz ferry Valerie was on had an intriguing past. Dona Paz was a ferry built in Japan in 1963. When first launched, it had a capacity of 608 passengers along with about 50 crew members. In 1975, it was transferred to the Philippines with new owner Subicio Line. At this time, the ship's capacity was increased to 1,518 people, operating on the Manila and Cebu water route. Notably, in 1979, Dona Paz encountered a fire while underway. Fortunately, all 1,164 passengers and crew survived because the ship ran aground in shallow waters, creating conditions for everyone to escape. After the fire, the ship was completely burned out. Subicio Line filed an insurance claim, then bought back the ship's wreck from the insurance company and had it recycled. Not stopping there, during this process, they added 2 more decks based on the original 2 decks. In other words, Subicio Line increased the ship's capacity, despite not updating the stability certificate. S stability when floating on water is the Subicio Line. Dona Paz was transferred to the route between Tacloban and Manila with a stop at Capanocan. With a frequency of 2 trips per week, the ferry's schedule was as follows: departing from Tacloban at 6:30 a.m., stopping at Capanocan, then continuing to Manila and decided to arrive at 4 a.m. the next day. Returning to Valerie's journey, she was now sitting quietly, huddled on the rear deck. Everything around was cramped and chaotic. Even a nearby man was urinating right on the ship's railing, because there were so many people that he couldn't make his way to the toilet. It can be seen that the captain of Dona Paz, Estrobio Narareno, and the crew did everything they could to serve, or more accurately, to accommodate more passengers. However, fortunately, the weather that night was clear. The sea was only slightly rough, and Valerie wasn't too bothered by it. As long as the weather was warm and the ferry, like Dona Paz, had these conditions, they were almost ideal. So passengers and crew settled into their seats, preparing for a long journey. But the sea always holds unpredictable uncertainties. Around 10:30 p.m., when Dona Paz was in the Tablas Strait, suddenly an oil tanker appeared right in front of the bow. Neither had time to change course, resulting in a horrific collision accompanied by an explosion. The oil drums immediately burst into fierce flames and spilled into the sea. It was known that this oil tanker was named Vector, 51 meters long, on its way from Baton to Mataste with over 1 million liters of gasoline and other petroleum products in its hold. It was chartered by Contact, a joint venture between Jailbone and Texaco. Vector had 13 crew members, and notably, the captain and first mate were both unqualified for their positions. Passengers and crew on the Dona Paz ferry woke up startled in extreme chaos. The flames from the Vector oil tanker quickly spread, engulfing both ships in a sea of fire. Even more terrifying, the flames from the oil tanker formed a massive oil fire cauldron spreading hundreds of meters. Amid the chaotic scene to avoid the fire on the ship, many passengers risked jumping into the sea, which was also covered in flames. They struggled to escape the fire, then fought the fear of swimming among charred bodies and even fierce sea creatures. People reached for life jackets, but they were too tight, and even if they could open them, there certainly weren't enough for nearly 4,500 people on this overloaded ferry. The heat on the ship was rising rapidly, and oil from the Vector continued to spill into the sea, intensifying the fire around the two ships. Vidori had woken up by then. Beside her was a man traveling with his daughter, shouting loudly for everyone to leave the ferry. That brave man was Salvador Pascal, a person who had witnessed many ship fires before and knew their terrifying speed of spread. On the fragile boundary between life and death, Vidori suddenly felt a sense of relief. She was both glad to have a life jacket and horrified at the thought of having to use it. Wait, Vidori couldn't. She could see the flames on the water and the fire ring spreading at a dizzying speed. So, Vidori decided to jump into the sea with Salvador and his daughter, with a slim hope of finding a way to survive in a sea of fire. Amid the towering sea of fire and pitch black night, a glimmer of hope appeared. Another passing ship had seen the horrific explosion and decided to head toward the fire for rescue. It was the Mr. Calodio. However, due to the massive and dangerous fire, the Mr. Calodio took an hour to reach the nearest safe position, which was within a 3.2 kilometers radius of the burning ships. If it got closer, the ship could be drawn into the patches of burning oil. A risk any sensible captain would avoid to keep the ship and crew safe. Later, the Mr. Calodio approached the stern of the Dona Paz, where Valerie and many other passengers were floating in the sea. The crew on the Mr. Calodio quickly lowered sturdy nets for the survivors to climb up. Valerie, Salvador, and his daughter were 3 of the 26 lucky survivors of this horrific disaster. To reach the rescue ship, they had to swim for over an hour. A grueling struggle for survival to stay away from the expanding fire ring caused by burning oil on the water's surface. In fact, most survivors were those who jumped from the stern of the Dona Paz and were lucky to swim in the right direction toward the Mr. Calodio. Perhaps that was the miracle of life. The Dona Paz ferry sinking disaster claimed the lives of over 4,000 people, a horrifying number that left an indelible pain for thousands of families. The Dona Paz sank at a depth of about 457 meters, 2 hours after colliding with the Vector oil tanker. And the Vector itself sank 2 hours later. The accounts of the survivors make us even more sorrowful. One father recounted that he tried to pull his daughter to safety, but the skin on her arm peeled off due to severe burns, and so she sank back into the sea. One of the direct causes of this tragedy was the ship's overloaded condition. For a ship registered to carry 1,518 people, the Dona Paz was carrying 4,374 people, including the crew. Thus, the ship was overloaded by nearly 3,000 people beyond its permitted limit. It was so overloaded that passengers had to sleep scattered all over the aisles, and the ship was tilted to one side due to the excessive weight on top. Although overloading was not the direct cause of the ship sinking, it led to many lives being unjustly taken. And little Valerie was not the only one who boarded the ferry without a proper ticket. What's more, the rescue efforts were extremely slow. It took nearly 8 hours for the Philippine Coast Guard to receive the notification, and then another 6 hours before they could contact the nearest Coast Guard station. By that time, Dona Bat and Vecto had long sunk. The golden time for rescue was unfortunately missed. In the following weeks and months, the question on everyone's mind was how this could have happened. How could two ships at sea on a calm and clear night collide and cause nearly 4,500 deaths? Was this just an unfortunate accident, or were there other underlying reasons? To find the answer to that question, a large-scale investigation was conducted. And sadly, what this investigation uncovered revealed a series of serious violations. The factors that led to this horrific disaster. Specifically, among the 13 crew members on the Becto and 56 on the Dona Paz, only one sailor was on watch duty. Even more concerning, he was an unqualified trainee. Meanwhile, some crew members on the Dona Paz were even drinking alcohol and certainly not at their assigned positions. The captain was watching a movie. Clearly, these actions violated an important regulation in maritime law. There must be someone on constant watch duty. If the watch crew had been at their assigned positions, they could have seen the other ship approaching and had enough time to change course to avoid the catastrophic collision. Ultimately, a main fault in this incident was attributed to the oil tanker Vector, which lacked proper supervision. The crew on the ship were unqualified, and the ship itself was operating without certification. Behind this disaster were also corrupt practices at all levels of the inspection process. These actions enabled the ship to set sail with numerous violations, despite potential dangers. Not stopping there, the investigation also pointed out other factors that contributed to the severity of the accident. First, all life jackets on the Dona Paz were locked up, preventing passengers from using them when the accident occurred. Second, the ship had no radio to communicate with other ships, so it couldn't warn about ships moving too close. However, all of this might still not have led to the disaster if there had been a proper watch system on one or both ships. The oil tanker Vector didn't appear out of nowhere. Simply, no one was on watch duty to see it approaching. Not only that, major oil companies like Trigon and Texaco also contributed to this accident by chartering ships without proper licenses and unqualified crews. It seems that at every stage of the inspection process, authorities not only failed to fulfill their responsibilities but also accepted bribes to overlook violations, while companies prioritized profits over the safety of customers and cargo. This incident undoubtedly revealed weaknesses in the management and supervision by the authorities. However, it wasn't until 2075, after 3 other ships of Sumicio land sank, causing nearly 1,500 deaths, that this company had its passenger transport license revoked. Isn't the price to pay for carelessness and irresponsibility too high? In reality, maritime accidents are not uncommon in the Philippines. In the 15 years before the Dona Paz accident, there were 80 collisions, 177 ship sinkings, 53 fires, and a total of 4,000 deaths on ships off the coast of this country. Including the Dona Paz incident, this number rises to over 10,000 people in a span of 43 years. Therefore, on average, about 232 people per year could not return after a voyage. During the investigation of the Dona Paz accident, senior officials of the Philippine Coast Guard also admitted that their staff sometimes accepted bribes to overlook violations. They also pointed out that this force was severely understaffed and lacked the resources to inspect every ship. Perhaps these are also the important reasons leading to the Dona Paz disaster and many other maritime accidents in the Philippines. Concluding the story of the Dona Paz disaster, we cannot help but feel sorrow for the fate of the unfortunate victims, including children like Valerie. Because her name was not on the passenger list, Valerie never received the $500 compensation given to the victims' families. She didn't even have enough money to return home and had to wait 25 years after the disaster to be reunited with her father. As for Subicio, after this scandal, the company switched to transporting cargo instead of passengers. And the good news is that since 2016, the number of fatalities in maritime accidents in the Philippines has significantly decreased, with only 113 people per year. However, the Dona Paz disaster remains an unhealed wound in the hearts of the Filipino people, while reminding us of the price paid for negligence, corruption, and irresponsibility. Hopefully, lessons from the past will help us better understand the importance of maritime safety to build a safer future for sea voyages. And that concludes our story for today. Thank you for listening and accompanying Kan Ha. Before leaving, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel to follow other fascinating and meaningful stories. Kanha thanks you very much and looks forward to seeing you in the next videos.
If the veil stirred, subscribe and meet the next encounter.